Hi there, welcome to Explain This, a podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today is our 50th episode! Woo! So, as a special treat, I thought we'd do something different. Today, instead of explaining to you a complex concept that we know a lot about, we're going to explain to you how we actually don't know a lot of things. Even things that seem basic and so fundamentally important, that surely we'd know all about the whys and hows about them. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, pretty much the entire shtick of this podcast is to take a complex concept that often requires specialist knowledge to fully grasp, take the important essence of it, then break it down and translate it down to multiple different levels of ease to make it more understandable. But what if I told you that there are things that even experts don't know? I say, isn't that hard to believe? But we do unfortunately live in a world where people trust experts less and less already, thanks to misinformation and disinformation. But hopefully, if you listen to this podcast, it's because you do care about the fact that there are people who dedicate their lives studying and thinking about niche topics, like how ambient temperature and the frequency of cricket chirps are related. So we can trust them when we need such information urgently, say, because there's a global disaster, such as a pandemic occurring. So, today we're going to look at 4 different fields: neuroscience, engineering, linguistics, and physics, and talk about some shockingly common yet unexplained things. I've been very excited to do this episode because there's so much about the universe that we don't know, and it's amazing to think that there's still troves of knowledge to unearth and discover out there. So much so that I've already found 2 topics that are too interesting and long to talk about to be part of this episode, so they'll get their own episodes in the future. Anyway, let's start with one of my pet topics, and a fan favorite question amongst little kids wanting to divide their bedtime. Why do we need to sleep? We spend about a third of our lives sleeping. So you could say it's pretty important for us, considering how much time it takes up. And it must be important if evolution just allows animals to be minimally aware of their surroundings and look dead for such a prolonged period of time. So considering how everybody sleeps, and how much we do it, we should know all about the mechanisms and reasons for sleep, right? Much like how we figured out why we breathe and how our heart beats and all that. Episode 34, Vital Organs. Get across it. And yet, apparently the phrase, sleep eludes us, isn't just a saying for when you're an insomniac. We actually don't fully know why we need to sleep. We know we have to. If you go for a prolonged period of time without sleeping, you literally die. The same goes for animals. Birds, fish, even insects need to sleep. But as of now, scientists don't have a proper consensus on the exact function of sleep. There's even a quip in the science circle. The only known function of sleep is to cure sleepiness. And if you think about it, it's not surprising that we know so little about why we need to sleep. Sleep is incredibly hard to research because the subject is unconscious while they're experiencing it. It's not like you can ask people what they're feeling while they're sleeping. Plus, it's happening inside the brain, possibly the greatest mystery of the human body. Since we still haven't figured out exactly how the intricate connections of neurons create all the complex processes that happen in the brain, by extension, we don't really get how sleep happens either. And it's not like you can just cut open a brain while someone's sleeping, or try to research it from a cadaver. So there are a lot of complexities when it comes to researching sleep. But that hasn't stopped us from trying. Thankfully, we have technologies such as functional MRIs and electroencephalograms, or EEGs, that have shed some light on some of the things that happen while we sleep. For example, we now have a pretty good picture of how sleep cycles work. When you sleep, your brain goes through 2 main cycles: REM, or rapid eye movement, and non-REM sleep. You think that when someone's sleeping, their brain must be pretty quiet. But actually during REM sleep, your brain is quite active. As the name suggests, your eyes dart around as if they're chasing invisible objects while you're in this phase of sleep. This is when dreams occur, and scientists think your brain is recalibrating and fine-tuning the emotional parts, kind of like a system reboot to prepare for the next day. Fun fact, during this phase, your body's paralyzed intentionally by the brain, so you don't act out your dreams. That's why we have fun things like sleep paralysis. After a period of REM sleep, you enter non-REM sleep, where your brain focuses more on the deeper parts, like converting your day of sensory stimuli and experiences into long-term memory. During this time, the cortex of your brain that does the thinky part relaxes, and you have a bit of a sensory blackout. You cycle between REM and non-REM sleep about 3 or 4 times a night. Each cycle lasts about 90 minutes, which is why some people, like myself, recommend setting alarms for the next day based on a multiple of 90 minutes to avoid waking up in the middle of a cycle and feeling super groggy. I find 7.5 hours or 9 hours to be a perfect amount. Anyway, this still doesn't fully explain why we sleep. Let's talk more about that. There are several competing theories on the purpose of sleep. It's very likely that with most things in the world, there's no one clear answer, and it's actually a whole lot of different reasons at the same time. One theory is that it conserves energy. Since we live on Earth where there is day and night, and no animal needs to be running around 24 hours, it makes sense to have a programmed downtime where you hunker down somewhere safe and not move and expend energy, right? Well, this sounds great in practice, but turns out you only save about 5 to 10% of your daily energy expenditure when you sleep. That's like one large apple or a bite of brownie. If only you could just eat a little more and not have to sleep. Think of how much you'd get done. So, this is probably not the whole answer. The other theory is that sleep is when our body goes through its restorative processes. This includes healing wounds, recharging your energy, and cleaning up all the wears and tears in your cells, kind of like a pit stop in Formula One racing. This is very important because, as you know, living is stressful. Specifically, your cells undergo something called oxidative stress when they're working. All of the chemical processes your cells go through produces something called free radicals, which are chemicals that have unpaired electrons that act as very scratchy thorns. These free radicals can damage other molecules such as your DNA, increasing your risk of cancer and other diseases. So, fortunately for us, we have natural processes that kick in while we're sleeping to clear our body of these free radicals and repair the oxidative damage they cause. This is particularly important in the brain, where there's a lot of activity that happens. We found that during sleep, this kind of maintenance work happens much more frequently, and that's why we think it might be one of the primary reasons we need to sleep. Related to this is the theory that sleep is actually super important for our brain function. Being a super complex meat computer is not an easy job. Think about just how much information your brain has to process in the course of a day. 25% of your sugar content goes to feed the brain. You're constantly making decisions, instructing your body to do things, and receiving a metric crap ton of sensory information, both things you're used to and new experiences. If you're an avid learner, you're also taking in new knowledge and information and things that you want to commit to memory. Well, your brain is pretty good at short-term memory, but if you leave it alone, it'll disappear like tears in a pizza oven, because it will get overridden by other information. So, you need to convert your short-term memory into long-term memory to learn effectively. We've covered this on our episode about spaced repetition in episode 7. Now, turns out a lot of that information processing and memory consolidation happens during our sleep. So, if you don't sleep well, you're not going to learn well, because your memory will be like a sieve. Which might explain why it was so hard to learn things back in high school as a teenager. Turns out, teenagers have a different circadian rhythm, or body clock, to adults. They have a tendency to fall asleep later and wake up later. Plus, they need 9 hours of sleep, whereas adults usually only need 7 to 8 hours. But because of the way our society works, teenagers are forced to go to school by 9 a.m., or earlier if they have a long commute. So they actually only end up with like 5 hours sleep on average, greatly hampering their ability to learn. Research has shown that a good night's sleep can increase your ability to solve problems threefold, so it's a pretty big deal. Lastly, there are a bunch of other things that seem to happen during sleep, such as balancing of hormones, such as your stress and growth hormones, as well as temperature management. All in all, we've learned a lot about sleep, but we still don't definitively know why we sleep. That said, we do know that we need to sleep well, because there's a mountain of evidence showing the dangers of sleep deprivation. We've already mentioned that it can impair your learning, and severe sleep deprivation can even lead to death. Your brain is hardwired to want to sleep every day, so if you're forced not to, because of things like shift work or all-nighters, your brain will sneakily try to override this through something called microsleeps. You've probably experienced this, where you find yourself nodding off and you don't remember what happened for the last few minutes. Microsleeps aren't so troublesome when it's happening to you in a cozy armchair by the sun, or when you're dropping your phone on your face because you're on Reddit before sleeping. But it is super dangerous if you're operating heavy machinery, such as a car. I remember there was a harrowing statistic I learned where more than half of junior doctors in Auckland reported finding themselves falling asleep on the wheel, driving home after a night shift. I've certainly had it happen to myself multiple times, and it's bloody scary. This is why we had strikes many years ago, so that we could have more sustainable rosters that we weren't going to kill ourselves in a car crash through sleep deprivation. Because 7 consecutive night shifts after 6 consecutive day shifts will certainly do that. Anyway, there are a plethora of serious incidents throughout history that have boiled down to people not functioning properly due to sleep deprivation. Chernobyl, the 3 Mile Island incident, Bhopal chemical plant explosion, the Challenger space shuttle explosion, so many plane and train crashes, all due to the lack of sleep. Which is why there's as much research looking at how we can get better, healthier sleep as those looking into why we sleep. If you're suffering from poor sleep, or just generally feeling exhausted every morning, I'd recommend you look into something called sleep hygiene. There are basic habits that improve your environment and make it easier for your body to fall asleep. For example, your bed should only be for sleep and sex. Avoid lounging around in bed on your phone for too long or lying wide awake in bed all night, because then your brain associates the bed as a wake place rather than a sleeping place. If you're not falling asleep, just leave the bedroom for 20 to 30 minutes and go do something else instead so you can break the cycle. Similarly, avoid lights, including your phone screen, for at least half an hour before bed. Alright, so hope that gave you some insight into why we think we need to sleep. Let's move on to our next topic that we don't know. How do bicycles keep themselves upright? Like the expression goes, riding a bicycle is pretty intuitive once you get used to it, and you don't really forget how to ride one after you learn it once. It's partially because it's actually not super complicated to ride a bike from the mechanical point of view. You just need to balance and push forward on the pedals. But it's also because the bicycle itself tends to help keep itself upright instead of falling over, as long as you're moving. That's the important part that beginners get wrong. Even when someone's not riding a bicycle, if you push it at enough of a speed, a bicycle will happily roll forwards for a while before falling over as it slows down. You'd think that since it's an invention, someone must have done a bunch of maths and theory testing to create such a wonderfully simple self-riding machine. But turns out, bicycles kind of happened on a fluke. I mean, not really, because a lot of thought and experimentation and trial and error occurred to create the modern bicycle. At the same time, people didn't really know why bicycles worked. They just knew that it did. So they kept improving the design to make it work better, trusting in the process. Before we delve into how we think bicycles work, let's talk about stability. Picture yourself balancing a standing pencil on the palm of your hands. If the pencil leans to one side, you'll naturally move your hand towards that direction, so the pencil stops leaning as much, right? What you've essentially done is you've moved the contact point, the part where the pencil touches your hand, to beneath the pencil's center of gravity. The center of gravity is basically where the weight is centered around. On a symmetrical object, it's usually bang in the middle. If one side is heavier than the other, the center of gravity is closer to the heavier spot. If an object's contact points are directly underneath the center of gravity, the object is stable. In your case, your feet are the contact point with the Earth, usually, and the center of your gravity lies in the rectangle that your feet make when you stand straight. If you keep your feet still and lean forwards too much, your center of gravity will eventually move beyond your toes and you'll fall over, unless you step forward and move the contact point. So, to keep an object stable, you need to move the contact point to under the center of gravity. In bicycles, the contact points are where the wheels touch the ground. The way you can move these would be to use the handles to steer the wheel. If the bicycle leans to the left, you turn the handle to the left, and suddenly, the contact point will move to the left to support the center of gravity. Now, bicycles have the magic property of automatically doing this, even when you don't consciously steer. You can see this in the riderless bike example. You can see that the bike's steering handles kind of wobble slightly, and then the bike suddenly becomes stabilized. So how does the bike know to do this? How is it so fine-tuned? Well, for a long time, people thought they had it figured out. They thought, the wheels of a bicycle must be acting as a gyroscope. If you don't know what a gyroscope is, don't worry, that's what we're here for. If you take a wheel and spin it really fast, then put it on its side, it will stay very stable. If you try to tip the wheel upwards or downwards, it naturally wobbles back to the horizontal state it was in. This is because of a physics principle called the conservation of angular momentum. Really simply put, because an object has to maintain the angle that it's moving at, the whole system compensates to keep that same orientation and strength. It's a pretty nifty thing that we use in compasses and mobile phones because a gyroscope will keep itself oriented exactly the same way, regardless of the rest of the frame. Anyway, people thought that the wheels of a bicycle must act like a gyroscope, so it keeps the whole frame upright to keep the angular momentum. And they thought this for many decades, until someone figured out that, hang on, if that's really the case, a bicycle should stay upright even if the handles can't turn. But when you do just this, and tape the handles so that they can't turn, a moving bicycle will just plop over on its side straight away. So there must be something else. Turning the handles must be important, much like our pencil stability experiment. So, another theory was hatched, the caster effect. Picture a shopping cart wheel, preferably one that's not broken if that's possible. You know how when you push the cart to one side, the wheels seem to spin around until they align up so the wheels point in the same direction? This is because these wheels are what we call caster wheels. If you look at them closely, what makes them unique is that the wheel isn't directly underneath the feet of the cart. It's angled away on a diagonal. This means that the contact point of the wheel is not directly under the steering axis, which would be the short poles that connect the wheel to the cart. The different positioning results in what's called a trail. Simply put, when the steering axis moves forwards, the wheel trails along, following the steering axis. If the steering axis changes directions, because the wheel's trailing behind, it also has to change directions to go towards the new direction. This makes it super useful for objects like shopping carts and desk chairs, where you need to push it in every direction. But turns out, this same caster effect might be what helped keep bikes upright. If you look at the front wheel of a bicycle, you would think that the wheel is in front of the steering handle. But if you look carefully, you'll find that the steering axis, the line that connects the steering handle to the wheel, is angled forwards. If you extend this line outwards, the line would hit the ground in front of where the wheel's contact point is. I'll include a diagram in the show notes if you can't visualize it. Anyway, what this means is that the front wheel of a bicycle acts like a caster wheel. So if the bicycle falls to one side, the trail automatically forces the front wheel to turn towards the fall, which, as we discussed earlier, means that it will stabilize the bicycle. Great! Gyroscopes and caster effects. Sound like we've figured out how bikes work. But of course, scientists are great at ruining fun as much as creating fun. Because some clever scientists decided to test out this theory by removing both effects from a bicycle. They made a strange contraption where not only did they add some extra wheels spinning the opposite direction to remove the gyroscopic effect, but also changed the angle of the wheels so that there was no longer a trail, as in no more caster effect. And despite this, the quote-unquote bicycle still could stand upright without a rider. What the hell? So clearly there is some other voodoo magic going on to keep bicycles upright. One of the latest theories is that because of the way center of gravity works, the front half of the bicycle is falling faster than the back half, which makes the handle turn towards the direction of lean, stabilizing the bike. But we still don't have conclusive proof, so despite the fact that bicycles are more than 200 years old, we still don't know how they work. Then again, it hasn't stopped us from using it as one of the most efficient and healthiest forms of public transport and holding races throughout entire countries, so I guess that's okay? Cool, let's take a short break before we move on to our next topic. Where did the word dog come from? Welcome back. Alright, here's a weird one. Why are dogs called dogs? This sounds like a philosophical question, like when my theory of knowledge teacher back in high school asked us why a banana is a banana. But it's more of a linguistics question. What is the origin of the word dog? We love some good etymology on the show, like how bacteriophage means eater of bacteria, how you can call a six-limbed animal like a dragon or a centaur a hexapod, and how the word dementia comes from de as in to lose or remove, and mentia as in your mind. Or that helicopter derives from the Greek words helico for spiral and t meaning wing. So you shouldn't be splitting it as heli and copter like helipad and quadcopter. You should really be saying helicopad and quadters. I love etymology. Now the fun thing about language is that it's not static. As much as we lament how the new generation is ruining language with text speak, abbreviations like ruffle-mao, and emojis, language is very much alive and changes with the people who use it. Which means that words we use now have a rich ancestry, spawning and changing from different forms of the word, with meanings that we wouldn't have thought of, because it seems like such a fundamental word now. For example, the word travel comes from the Latin word trepalium, which means torture instrument. Yeah, I guess traveling wasn't easy, especially in the days before airplanes and trains and bandits everywhere. Anyway, back to dogs. Considering they're called man's best friend and have been an integral part of our society for so long, you'd think they're important enough that we definitely know the etymology of the word dog, right? I mean, we already know where the word cat comes from. It comes from an Old English word cat with two T's, which itself came from a Proto-Germanic word catus, which came from the Latin catus, which can also be traced back to the late Egyptian word coat, which is funny because cats are indeed very coat. But what about dogs? Well, if we trace back the origin, we get to the Middle English word dog, then probably the Old English word dogga, D-O-G-G-A, or docga, D-O-C-G-A, which refers to the specific breed of dogs called mastiffs. But then the trail kind of goes cold. That's right, we don't really know where the word dog comes from. Strangely, it's one of the greatest mysteries in linguistics. And people have been trying hard. There's a lot of possible root words which we'll explore. Side note, excuse my horrendous pronunciation. I can barely pronounce modern English, let alone Old English, which is just a whole nother language. Alright, first, there are the words that mean dark, like the Old English word dox, meaning dark or swarthy, or the Old Norse word dokkr, D-O-K-K-R, meaning dark. So maybe the word refers to dark-furred dogs, or referring to the fact that they descended from wolves that hunt in the night. Secondly, there's the Proto-West Germanic word dugen, which means to be suitable, and the similar Old English word dugen, to be good, worthy, and useful. So maybe the word dog originates from an epithet, like, this is Doug, the useful animal. Other words that have been suggested as a possible origin include a Proto-West Germanic word dokka, D-O-K-K-A, meaning a round ball of muscle, and dukon, meaning strength, because strong dogs. There's also the theory that it comes from the Dutch word dogge, D-O-G-G-E, meaning codfish or bottom feeder, probably where the verb to duck came from. Lastly, there's the Old Norse word dugga, D-U-G-G-A, meaning worthless fellow, which suggests a more negative association. But we just don't know which of these is the one true origin of the word dog. What we do know is that the word dog is actually reasonably new, because up until the 14th century, English people preferred using the word hound for all domestic canines. You can still see this in other European languages that do something similar, like the German Hund, Dutch Hond, Norwegian Hund, and Icelandic Hundur. The word that eventually became dog was actually used only for mastiffs and bulldogs, and was considered a derogatory term, like they're a lesser, rougher canine. But for some reason, around the 16th century, we see dog becoming the more popular term for canines, whereas hound was used more for hunting dogs. Maybe mastiffs became more and more popular as house dogs, so the name kinda stuck, like how brand names become the default term, such as Klaxon, Hoover, and Zoom. But this still doesn't explain where the word dog came from. And it's so strange because not only are dogs so prevalent in our lives, but even the word has entrenched itself into the English language. Like how we call a sleazy man a dog, and we also use dog as an adjective for useless objects. And then there are delicious hot dogs. There's also a ton of expressions that involve dogs, like a dog's life is a miserable subservient life, a dog-eat-dog world to suggest a cruel world that you have to fight to survive in, or dog days being over, where you look back on hard times. There's also terms like, excuse my French, but bitch and son of a bitch, or mongrel to insult someone, clearly insinuating that it's bad to be descended from an animal like a dog. Funnily, these terms are found throughout the world in many other languages, so the negative connotation with dog seems oddly common. Then again, as we talked about with sleep and bicycles, even if we don't know where the word dog comes from, we can see that we use it with no problem in our daily lives, or even when we're using the word for imagery. So, as interesting it is to hunt for the ancestry of the name, we can still use it and apply it. It's just so interesting that the past can be as opaque as the future sometimes. Okay, last little tidbit about dogs and names. You probably know about Kerberos, the mighty three-headed dog that guards the gate of the underworld in ancient Greek mythology. And yes, a version of him features in the Harry Potter world as well. Well, when linguists look for the possible meaning of the name Kerberos, one of the theories put forward is that it might come from a Proto-Indo-European word meaning spotted. That's right, Kerberos literally means spot. Because who says a fearsome guardian dog can't also be an endearing pet with an adorable name? Alright, we're finally down to our last topic, and it's a big one. How does gravity work? We all know the famous phrase, what goes up must come down, because duh. But why do things fall to the ground? Why do we have this arbitrary up and down? Well, you probably know that it's all thanks to gravity, the universal force that causes two objects to attract each other, much like love. You've probably also been told that Isaac Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head, and he pondered why the apple should fall down to Earth. But of course, like every interesting story and factoid, this isn't quite accurate. Because A, the apple falling on Newton's head is definitely an apocryphal story and probably never happened. And B, people already knew about gravity before Newton. What Newton did was far greater than realizing that gravity existed. No. But we'll get to that. First, let's take a brief history lesson about gravity. People have always known that if you drop an object in the air, it will fall to the ground. We've made a lot of weapons based on this fact. They might fall quickly if they're a heavy ball, and slower if they're a light feather. But things always fall down, hence the saying. Even the ancient Greeks knew this well, and they were already pondering why this might be the case. They knew there was some force that was pulling objects down, and the great philosopher Aristotle thought that this was due to an object's heaviness, or gravitas. Aristotle thought that heavier objects fall at a faster rate because they had more gravitas. Simple, right? Now, Aristotle had some generally correct ideas, like how the Earth must be spherical because things all around the world are falling towards some central point, but this was also the time when people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, so it made sense to them. He also thought that elements like fire and air float upwards because they have a property called levity that made them attracted to the moon in the sky. So yeah, definitely not perfect. Even so, Aristotle's theory on gravity was the most popular theory in the Western world for over 1100 years. There were several people that challenged his ideas, such as Vitruvius thinking that gravity was due to an object's density or specific gravity, and Pliny the Elder noticing that the moon's gravity affected the tides of Earth's oceans. In the East, there were some clever mathematicians and astronomers that had started figuring out that gravity was a force, not just unique to the Earth, but to objects. The Indian mathematician Brahmagupta was the first to describe gravity as an attractive force back in the 7th century AD. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci was able to figure out a close approximation of calculating how strong gravity was, which we now know as 9.8 meters per second, as in an object that is falling accelerates by a speed of 9.8 meters per second every second. So over time, it gets faster and faster. In the 16th century, Copernicus figured out that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. And then we get to the 17th century, when we really made some breakthroughs. We discussed this a bit back in episode 33, when we talked about the scientific method and the replication crisis. Galileo did some key experiments that ended up proving Aristotle and his theory of gravity wrong. He found that although we think heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects, this is purely due to air resistance. So, if you drop two metal balls from a tall tower, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, at the same time, one 1 kg and another 100 gram, both balls would hit the ground at exactly the same time. Whoa. Turns out the reason why feathers fall slower than hammers is because feathers are all feathery with a lot of surface area, so it catches the wind and floats. If you take a feather and hammer to the moon where there's no atmosphere and drop them both at the same time, they hit the ground at the same time. And yes, NASA did exactly that experiment just to absolutely prove Galileo right. You can watch videos of it if you want. Anyway, so by this point, we're starting to figure out some of the mechanics of gravity and how to calculate how fast things would fall. But it still doesn't explain why this force happens. Don't worry, we're not finished yet. And we're finally up to Isaac Newton. Now, regardless of what exactly inspired Newton, Apple or not, he figured out some crucial things about gravity using observation and mathematics. I'm not going to bore you with all the details on how he came to these findings, and instead, we're going to skip ahead to one of the most famous books ever written in the history of science, De Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, it's a mouthful, or The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Also simply called Principia, this book was a textbook that became the foundation of classical mechanics, the study of how things move. If you've heard about Newton's laws of motion, and phrases like every action has an equal and opposite reaction, those are from Principia. But the Principia also talks about Newton's law of universal gravitation. As we've explained, by this point, scientists knew from Galileo's works that gravity is universal and uniform at 9.8 meters per second per second. Newton took this one step further and figured out exactly how the mechanics of gravity works between two objects. He realized two important things. First, every particle attracts every other particle in the universe with a force that is proportional to the product of their masses, as in, the heavier the object, the stronger the gravitational pull. Secondly, he also figured out that this force is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between their centers. Simply put, the further two objects are from each other, the weaker their attraction becomes. You might think, hang on, that sounds a bit like Aristotle's theory. But here's the kicker. Newton figured out that because the Earth is so massive, and most objects on Earth are so tiny, that the difference between a 1 kg ball and a 100-gram ball is so minute that it doesn't affect the strength of gravity at all. As in, the Earth is pulling everything on its surface at almost exactly the same force, 9.8 meters per second per second. The funny thing is, all of these objects also have their own gravity, so they're trying to pull back on the Earth as well. But because their masses are so hugely different, the pull is negligible and Earth's gravity wins over. At the same time, all of these maths became super useful when calculating how other giant objects interact with Earth and each other. That is, heavenly bodies. Newton was able to use his formulas to conclusively show how the moon orbits the Earth, and how the Earth orbits the sun, being able to calculate all their masses and distances based on the gravity involved between all of them. This was groundbreaking work. Not only did we go from figuring out why gravity seems to be universal regardless of how heavy an object, because Earth is so massive, but we could predict how other massive objects behave with each other based on their mass and distance from each other. Okay, cool. So we've got a pretty dang good idea on how gravity works and interacts, but why gravity? Why are objects attracted to each other? How does the sun know how far Earth is from it to exert that amount of gravity? And why does it get weaker as the distance gets bigger? What makes mass generate gravity? Well, Newton didn't know. He literally called it a spooky action, which sounds like the science equivalent of the aliens meme. Except scientists are usually okay saying that they don't know something, instead of confidently making things up. And even without knowing exactly why the equations worked, Newton was able to prove how accurate his work was with observational data of planets and stars and moons. So now, we fast forward time again to the start of the 20th century, when we come across another famous scientist who broke the paradigm and elevated our understanding of the universe. That man is Albert Einstein. Einstein did a lot of work in physics, but today we'll talk specifically about the theory of general relativity. Without going into too much detail, because I'm sure we'll talk about the two theories of relativity deeper in future episodes, Einstein's theory of general relativity boils down to this. Gravity is not really a force per se. There's no invisible particle like a graviton that causes gravitational attraction. Instead, gravity is the product of the inherent property of mass to curve space-time. Now, this sounds like a Yo Mama joke, but Einstein was again able to prove his theories with maths and observational data. He proposed that space-time, as in three-dimensional space and time, act like a piece of fabric or a giant field. objects that are super heavy, such as a planet or a star, act like a heavy ball placed on a stretched out rubber sheet. They cause a big dip, curving the fabric of space-time. This curvature in space-time means that if another object was to approach the curve, it will start rolling faster and faster towards this gravitational well, being attracted to the center of it. The heavier the object, the deeper this well, and the closer the objects are, the steeper the fall. So this theory ties in neatly with Newton's laws, while explaining how gravity seems to know instantly when an object is within a certain range. Einstein's theory helped explain things like gravitational lensing, gravitational waves, and even predicted the existence of black holes, where the object is so heavy and dense that the gravity traps even the fastest thing in the universe, light. But as cool as this is, we still don't know why mass curves space-time. It just does, and we can super accurately predict how curved space-time becomes. In fact, we're so good at calculating the mechanics of gravity that we can launch rockets away from Earth, proving that not everything that goes up must come down, as long as you shoot it up fast enough. But we can also land people on the moon 380,000 kilometers away, and robots land on an exact crater on Mars with hyper-precision 225 million kilometers away. And that's pretty dang mathematical. Which brings us to a very important point. Is it okay to not know? We've covered a variety of topics, and the common theme was that even though they seem basic or obvious or common, there are many things that we just don't know. We live in the information age, where because we're so saturated with information and have instant access to it, that we have an expectation that we should know everything. Like, everyone needs to have a hot take opinion on every world issue the moment it happens. Everyone needs a reason, and if experts cannot provide them, they'll turn to people who claim they know the reason, because aliens. But a huge part of science and knowledge is the acceptance that we just don't know everything. There's too much to know in the world. What's more important is that we accept that we don't know something, and we ask, well, how can we know? What can I do to figure out the answer? Or do I need to know the answer right now? Think about it. We don't need to know what causes gravity to calculate the orbital mechanics of the moon and rocket trajectories. We don't need to know how bicycles work to ride one to work. And it's not like people aren't actively trying. There's ongoing advancements in neuroscience and quantum physics that are giving us more and more insights into how these mysterious forces like sleep and gravity work. And who knows, we might even discover that Einstein was wrong, or that the word dog comes from an ancient term describing goodest of boys. One of the best qualities we possess is our curiosity, our drive to learn more about the world we live in, and to keep challenging the status quo to advance towards truth. And if we don't know something, it shouldn't make us anxious or bruise our egos, but it should make us even more curious. I've always said that you should not trust someone who claims to know everything, because chances are they're lying either to you or themselves. What's much more impressive is a person who has the courage to say, I don't know. Let's look it up together. No one likes to be wrong or to look stupid, but if we let pride get in the way, we could never improve and grow. So remember, it's okay not to know the answer, as long as you're open to learn, because that's how things get better. So, what did we learn today? We learned that we don't know why we sleep, but we know that it is very important to get a good night's sleep, so our brains can consolidate and heal. We learned that we don't know why bicycles stay upright when they're moving, but we figured out things that make bikes more or less stable, and how balance works. We learned that we don't know where the word dog comes from, but there are some interesting possible roots. We learned that we don't know why gravity works the way it does, but it didn't stop us from figuring out the exact mechanisms and maths behind it so we can put people on the moon. Lastly, we learned that it's absolutely okay to not know things, because that's how we learn. Alright, for today's 2-Minute Explain, let's talk about something that we do know as of very recently. Why ice is slippery. For a long time, we didn't actually know why ice is slippery. Specifically, how skates work to glide along the ice. The common explanation is that the friction of the skate gliding on the ice causes enough heat to melt the ice, forming a thin layer of water that provides lubrication. But this doesn't make sense, because there's not enough time for the ice to melt just because the skate is touching it. Plus, ice is slippery even when you're not moving, like just standing on it can make you slip backwards. Okay, so maybe the pressure caused by the weight of you and the skates increases the temperature of the ice to melt the parts in contact with the skates? Well, this used to be the prevailing theory, because turns out ice is less dense than water. So if you push on it hard enough, it becomes water even when it's cold. Yeah, physics isn't as straightforward as you think. But turns out, if you actually look at the mathematics of it, your weight is nowhere enough to melt ice. It would only raise the temperature by a fraction of a degree Celsius, and you actually need something like 3,000 kilograms of weight to turn ice into water. So yeah, for a very long time, we didn't know why ice was slippery, much like our other topics today. Thankfully, in the last few years, scientists figured out that the surface of ice acts a bit differently to the rest of the ice. There's a very, very, very thin layer, like one atom thick, of water in a state called quasi-liquid. In this layer, the water is still too cold and not under enough pressure to be a liquid. But because ice is essentially a crystal structure with all the water molecules held to each other through polar attraction, the water molecules on the surface of this crystal don't have enough buddies to hold on to stay solid. Because of this, the surface layer of water kind of tumbles around, loosely sticking and unsticking to the other water molecules, enough to act almost like a liquid. This thin quasi-liquid layer is what makes ice slippery. You can see this experimentally by taking two ice cubes, pushing them together, and seeing them stick, because the quasi-liquid layer has solidified now that there's enough water molecules for each other to hold on to. We're still learning more and more about this quasi-liquid layer, but it's pretty cool that we live in an age where we finally figured out why ice is so slippery. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This for 50 episodes. I never thought that I'd be able to keep producing this podcast for so long, and currently I have no plans on stopping. If anything, I have plans on uploading episodes to YouTube, and maybe even making a Patreon to help offset some of the costs involved. If you have any feedback on how to improve the podcast, suggestions for ideas, or things you might want to see as a Patreon perk, send me an email on explainthiscast@gmail.com, or leave a comment on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, because I refuse to call it X. Anyway, I appreciate you so much for coming to learn all sorts of things with me on a monthly basis. Love you all, and I'll see you next time with a brand new episode. Bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter